Hi all, welcome back to another lecture in our online philosophy B10 Intro to Ethics class. Today we're talking about social contract theory, or as it's sometimes called, contractarianism. So the principal figures that we'll be introduced to today are Thomas Hobbes, a British philosopher who lived from 1588 to 1679, and John Rawls, an American philosopher who lived from 1921 to 2002. Both made significant contributions to this moral theory, but let's get into what the theory is, because that's more important than who said what. But before we get into it, let's talk about what social contract theory will aim to give us. So it will aim to give us a procedure for determining if an action is right or wrong. So proceduralist views like social contract theory, like utilitarianism, like deontology, attempt to give foundational principles which are supposed to explain and justify why certain actions are right and why certain actions are wrong. So with consistent application of those principles to cases, we can determine whether or not we should do something, and they explain why we should or should not do it. So take, for example, the practice of holding slaves. Utilitarianism offered us a procedure for determining if that was right or wrong. For utilitarians, the procedure to determine if anything is right or wrong is to first ask yourself, is it the action which will lead to the most happiness out of the available alternatives? If it is the one which leads to the most happiness, then it's right. If it's not the one that leads to the most happiness, then it's wrong, because there's a better thing we should be doing. When it comes to the practice of holding slaves, it's clearly wrong according to utilitarianism, since utilitarians say we should be strictly indifferent when it comes to people's well-being, and we should consider the well-being of people who are enslaved. So if we put all of the good and all of the bad, the tremendous amount of bad and suffering that comes out of the practice, it's easy to see why utilitarians would be against the practice. The principle of humanity offered by deontologists also gives us a procedure for determining if actions are right or wrong, and explains why they're right or wrong. So the principle of humanity tells us that we should not use autonomous, rational beings as mere means to our ends. And in the practice of keeping slaves, that's clear that rational, autonomous beings are being used as mere means to other people's ends. So that tells us that that action is wrong, and also explains why it's wrong with reference to that principle. So social contract theory, or contractarianism, the view that morality is based on a social contract, is going to offer us a procedure for determining if actions are right or wrong. But before we get to what that procedure is, let's talk about some concerns or a problem that social contract theory was developed to solve, or some considerations from which social contract theory arose. And I found somebody who does a much better job of explaining this than I would. So let's watch a quick 2-minute video on what are called prisoners' dilemmas, and then I'll talk about some philosophical implications of the view.
Let's suppose that you're writing a really important email to a colleague.
Hi, this is Fresh Talker. Let's discuss the prisoner's dilemma. You and your partner in crime have been apprehended by the police. The officer explains they don't have much evidence, and if you both hold out, then you will each serve 1 year in jail. The officer wants you both to confess, in which case you'll serve 2 years in jail each. He also explains that if only one of you confesses, that person goes free, and the other will serve 4 years in jail as a penalty for holding out. He separates you and your partner, and you think about it. If you could trust your partner and you both held out, then you'd only serve 1 year in jail. However, if your partner confesses and you don't, then you will serve 4 years as a penalty for holding out. That doesn't sound very good, so you think about it logically. If your partner confesses, then you'll serve 4 years in jail for holding out, but only 2 years for confessing. On the other hand, if your partner holds out as well, then you'll serve 1 year in jail for holding out, and you'll go free if you confess. Clearly, confessing is less jail time for you, no matter what your partner does. Your partner goes through a similar calculus and realizes confessing is better for him, no matter what you do. So in the end, you both confess to the crime and serve 2 years in jail. And that's the strange part, because if you had both held out, you would have only served 1 year in jail each. The prisoner's dilemma is a conflict between doing what's best for yourself as an individual and considering the group and what might be best for the group. Please subscribe to my channel. I make videos on math and game theory. You can support me on Patreon. Catch me on my blog, Mind Your Decisions, on Twitter at @PreshTalker, and you can get my book on game theory called The Joy of Game Theory, which discusses the prisoner's dilemma.
All right, so what was discussed in the video is the prisoner's dilemma. And the problem in prisoner's dilemma type situations is that it's rational for both people to look out for their own self-interest. Because take, for example, Bob and Al are two criminals who were caught in this case. And they're held in separate cells, and the police tell them if they confess, they'll get a lighter sentence. If they remain silent, they'll get a stricter sentence. In the example given in the video, and the example you see on this table here, it's for each person, it's better that they betray the other person, that they not cooperate with their partner. So in this chart, we see if Bob, on the top there, confesses, then what should Al do? Well, if Al remains silent, then he'll get 6 years. But if he confesses, he'll get only 4 years, the number on the left-hand side there. Well, what about if Bob remains silent? So he cooperates with Al. He doesn't say they committed the crime. Well, if Bob remains silent, then Al could remain silent and get 2 years, or he could confess and get 0 years. So for Al's decision, we're looking at the left-hand side here. And for Bob's decision, we're looking at the right-hand side. And what we see is whether or not Bob confesses or remains silent, the right thing for Al to do if he's rationally self-interested is to betray Bob, to confess, right? So, and the same goes for Bob. So if they're both rational in this situation, they'll both betray the other. But in this case, in my example, they both end up with 4 years because they both confessed. Whereas if they had actually cooperated, they both would have had 2 years in prison. And that would maximize the good of all the options. So note in that top left box, there's only 4 years being served. In the top right and bottom left, there's 6 years being served by one person. And then bottom right, there's 8 years. So what we get is a situation where each person rationally pursuing their own self-interest ends up with the worst outcome. So they both serve 4 years, 8 years total served, whereas the best outcome would have been they both cooperate. But there's no real incentive for them to cooperate because regardless of what the other person does, they'll always be better off if they confess, if they betray the other person. So in these cases, there's intense competition. So what are these relevant to? Prisoners' dilemmas are relevant to situations where there's intense competition for scant resources, and where everyone would be better off by scaling back their pursuit of their own self-interest for the collective good. So when do we face circumstances like this? Well, we face circumstances in what Thomas Hobbes calls the state of nature. In the state of nature, cooperation is very risky because if you're putting yourself out there to cooperate with somebody, somebody might take advantage of you. So people tend not to cooperate with and jealously guard their own self-interest. But as Hobbes recognized, the state of nature is what he called nasty, brutish, and short. So human beings without any society live a brutal existence and are likely to die really quickly, suffer a lot. The average lifespan will be really, really short, and it won't be a fun place. So what we'd like to do is escape that state of nature. We would like to start acquiring goods for everybody, make it so everybody was better off. But to do that, we need first rules that reward cooperation and punish betrayal. And two, an enforcer powerful enough to enforce the rules. Why do we need these things? We need these things because in the state of nature, it seems rational when you can't necessarily trust anybody else to jealously look out, rationally pursue your own self-interest. And rationally pursuing your own self-interest will not directly lead to you cooperating with people. Because if you put yourself out there, you might, somebody could very easily take advantage of you. So we need these rules to escape the state of nature. So what procedure does social contract theory offer us to determine if actions are right or wrong? Let's take a look. Contractarianism holds that actions are morally right just because they're permitted by the rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by on the condition that others obey these rules as well. So we are all rational, self-interested beings, and we want what's best for us. But not all of us can have the most power and wealth, and if we're all struggling and fighting against each other to try to acquire the most power, wealth, etc., happiness, then we are all going to suffer as a result of that conflict. In the prisoner's dilemma, that would be the scenario where both people end up with 4 years, so 8 years' time being done. But what we want is to get to that box where just 4 years time is being done, 2 years by both people, and to do that, we need to compromise. We need to say that we won't pursue our self-interest to the fullest extent, because that, if everybody did that, that will lead to a very bad circumstance. So what do? We compromise to avoid the likelihood of a brutal existence. We set up some rules, and we say we're going to follow those rules so long as other people follow those rules. And there'll be rules upon which we can have mutual benefit. All right, so let's talk about some advantages of this procedure for determining the rules of morality and for telling us why we should follow the moral rules. So first of all, according to social contract theory, morality is essentially a social phenomenon. So when do we need morality? We need morality as soon as there is more than one person rationally pursuing their own self-interest. If there's just one person stranded on an island, they don't need a system of morality. There are no moral obligations to yourself, according to social contract theory. You can do whatever you want with yourself. If you want to sit around wasting your life away, doing some non-productive activity, or an activity that doesn't even make you happy, you're totally welcome to that, so long as you're not infringing on other people, right? So morality is essentially a social phenomenon. We need to have rules in place to facilitate the mutual benefit, the cooperation and mutual benefit of multiple people. Second, social contract theory explains and justifies the content of moral rules. So John Rawls, the recent American philosopher who we talked about who we introduced at the beginning of this video, he asked us to consider the following thought experiment. Imagine before we were born into this world, we were all existed in another world, and in that world, we were stripped of the features that distinguish us from one another. So behind what he calls a veil of ignorance, we would have to decide what sort of rules we would want to follow when we were born into this world. So behind that veil of ignorance, we would know nothing of our religious identity, or our ethnicity, our social or economic status, our sex, our moral character, any of that. And we would have to decide, not knowing which lot we'd get, what rules we would all like to agree to follow. So what rules would free, equal people who didn't know whether they'd be rich or poor in this world, who didn't know what race they would be, what sex they would be, or whether they'd be good or bad people coming into this world, what rules would we all agree to for mutual benefit? Well, some rules, it seems it would be pretty straightforward. We wouldn't want there to be all the moral rules that we take for granted, right? So we wouldn't want there to be killing, rape, battery, theft. Why wouldn't we want those things to exist? Because we wouldn't want them to happen to us, right? But more interesting and more important, we also would want to prohibit any sort of bias that people might have, and people acting on bias, being racist, racist policies, sexist policies, anything which would exhibit biased behavior to anyone. Why would we want to all follow those sort of rules? We would want to all follow those sort of rules because if we're rational, self-interested people looking out for the mutual benefit of the group, well, we want, and if we didn't know whether we would be born a man or a woman, white, black, Latino, or whatever, if we didn't know how we would be born, then we would want to make sure, well, whatever lot we were born into, we wouldn't be discriminated against. So social contract theory gives us a nice justification for why racism and sexism are wrong, and it also explains and justifies the content of the moral rules which we regularly take for granted, prohibitions against killing, rape, and theft, and things like that. Along the same lines, it gives us a method for justifying any rule. So we don't just have to fall back on intuition and say something like, well, can't you just plainly see that killing people is wrong? Because somebody might not see, right? And so it gives us a method for justifying the rule. What procedure do we go through? We have to first consider what free, equal people would agree to for their mutual benefit, and see if the action that we're considering, whether it's right or wrong, see if that's the sort of action that would be allowed by the rules that free, equal people would come to for their mutual self-interest. Fourth, social contract theory explains the objectivity of morality. So a moral theory would be very problematic if it rested the moral status of actions on people's mere intuitions, on people's feelings about a matter. If morality was entirely subjective, then an action would be right or wrong just depending on how somebody felt about it, and people feel differently about things, so an action would be both right or wrong from depending on which perspective you took up, and that seems problematic. It doesn't seem like a system of morality at all, it just seems like a mess of feelings. Social contract theory, on the other hand, offers us some objectivity for morality, and let's get into that a little bit. So any individual person could be wrong about the moral status of an action, and not just any individual person, but also entire societies could be wrong about the morality of an action. Because an individual or an entire society could be applying rules, could have come up with the rules of morality that are different from the rules that free, equal people, free, equal, self-interested people would come up with for their own mutual benefit. And if the rules are different, then they're wrong. And this will lead us into our fifth advantage. So social contract theory explains why it is sometimes okay to break the rules. Generally, we should follow the rules that allow us to live in a lawful society. So the rules, why should we do that? Because we don't want to go back to the state of nature, and we all are better off living in that sort of society. But social contract theory explains why it's sometimes okay to break the rules. It's okay to sometimes break the rules because we only agree to follow the rules according to social contract theory, given that other people are following them, given that the rules that we're asked to follow are rules that we would agree to if we were free, rational, self-interested individuals. If it's ever the case that other people are breaking the rules, or that the laws are set up in an unfair way where free, rational, self-interested people would not agree to those rules, then social contract theory gives us the resources for saying why sometimes it's okay to break the rules, why social disobedience might be permissible in some cases. If laws are built in ways that they are biased, that some people are systematically disadvantaged, then social contract theory gives us a nice explanation and justification for why it would be okay to break the rules in those circumstances. All right, so having talked about the advantages of social contract theory, let's now move to some of the potential problems. So first of all is the problem of consent. And the problem starts with the recognition that we've never actually consented to the social contract. It is wrong to coerce people without their consent. So is it wrong to coerce people to follow the laws of the society in which they're born into? So one thing to note, one way a social contract theorist could solve this problem is they could say, well, look, social contract theory doesn't require anyone's actual consent. What determines whether an action is right or wrong is about what we would agree to under certain conditions. So it's a hypothetical. It doesn't require that we sign on a dotted line saying that we'll follow rules. Our consent is implied to the rules that people would agree to, rationally self-interested, free people would agree to. Those are the rules we have to follow, and it doesn't matter that we haven't actually consented to them. Our consent is implied. So let's skip to this problem, which is the scope of the moral community. So let's talk about what previous theorists thought about the scope of the moral community, and then we'll move on to what social contract theorists consider the scope of the moral community. So what is the scope of the moral community first? It's a consideration about the moral community is a statement about who deserves our moral consideration, to what extent they deserve our moral consideration, and who or what does not deserve our moral consideration. So let's remind ourselves what some other theories thought about this. So for utilitarians, anything that could feel pleasure or pain, or anything that had interests, all of those beings were in the moral community, and their interests or their feelings, the pleasure and pain that they felt, that all got considered equally. So the pain or pleasure that any being feels, that gets considered just as if it was the pain or pleasure that any other being could feel. So all those things are in the moral community. What's out? Anything which can't feel pleasure and pain, anything which doesn't have interests. So what's all in? Any sort of human being, many non-human animals are in. What's out? Inanimate objects, things like ecosystems. A river doesn't directly deserve moral consideration. That's how the moral community is constructed according to utilitarians. How about for deontologists? For deontologists, the narrow community was much more narrow. It included only rational and autonomous individuals, so beings which were able to figure out complex means to their ends, and beings who were able to set moral rules for themselves and be motivated by those moral rules to act. But anything else was not in the moral community, did not get our moral consideration. So that's problematic because non-human animals are out of the moral community. And even some human beings don't make up the moral community. So infants, the severely mentally disabled, those are examples of people who would not be in the moral community according to deontologists because they're not rational nor autonomous. So who would be in the social community and who would be out? Who would be in the moral community for social contract theorists and who would be out? So contractors, so the people who make the rules that are made by contractors. Contractors are rational and self-interested. Are they necessarily generous or self-sacrificing? No. One of the attractive features of social contract theory is it builds morality out of people's rational self-interest. If we determine that the contractors are necessarily generous or self-sacrificing, that they're providing rules which would give people things without taking anything in return, then we lose the attractive feature of the procedure that social contract theory gives us. So, the contractors won't necessarily be generous or self-sacrificing, so what features will they have? Well, people who are in the moral community, according to social contract theorists, will meet the following criteria. There'll be both potential threats, or one or the other, potential threats or potential benefactors, or both. They would be our equals to a certain extent, and we must be unable to gain anything from them without their consent. Why would these beings have to be included in our social contract? They would have to be included in our social contract so that we can benefit from them, right? So these would be beings who, if we left them out of the social contract, they would be threats to us. Beings that, if we brought them into the social contract, they could benefit us. They have to have a relatively equal power level to us, otherwise they could just take advantage of us, or we could just take advantage of them. And we have to be unable to gain anything from them without their consent. So this leads to a very narrow scope of the moral community. Non-human animals would be out of the moral community. Why would non-human animals be out of the moral community? Because we don't have to let them into the moral community. First of all, they won't understand in many cases, or maybe in all cases, the laws, acting based on laws and rules. So they're not our equals in that regard. We've minimized the ways that they can threaten us. And we can take everything from them without giving them anything in return. And in fact, we do that. So in factory farming circumstances, we take everything from non-human animals, their freedom, their lives, their relationships with other animals, and we do that for our well-being. Why do we do that? Why are we justified in doing that according to social contract theory? Really, because might makes right. They are not in a position where they can be a threat to us, and we can take everything from them without giving them anything in return. So we would have no moral obligations to non-human animals. We can do with them what we will. But a problem arises. What would a powerful alien race's moral obligations be to us should they encounter us? Now, you might think this is a very far out scenario, but it gets to a heart of a potentially big problem with social contract theory, and that is this problem that might can make right. So imagine a powerful alien race comes to Earth, and they want to farm us all in a sort of factory farming system, a similar system that we use for, cows or pigs or ducks or whatever. How could we try to convince them not to do that to us? Well, if we were social contract theorists, we wouldn't have any moral grounds to appeal to them, because they might say to us, well, look, you're not our equals. You're not a threat to us, and we can take everything from you without giving anything in return. So it's not in our rational self-interest, me speaking from the powerful alien's perspective, to allow you to bring you into our social contract. So we're just going to go with this arrangement. And if we're social contract theorists and we think that the only way beings get moral status is by meeting these three criteria that we've listed out, then we would have no moral appeal. We just have to submit to our new overlords and try to make the best of it. So why is that a problem? Because their social contract theory leaves out beings which are especially vulnerable. So non-human animals, marginalized populations that don't have the collective power to be a threat. And it licenses the exploitation of these groups, and that's very problematic. So, while social contract theory, social contract theory gives us a nice procedure for determining if an action is right or wrong. It grounds morality in the rational self-interest that human beings all naturally have. It allows us to escape the state of nature. It gives us, it justifies the moral rules we have, tells us which we're obligated to follow, tells us why we're not obligated to have any moral rules that apply just to us as individuals, but that morality is essentially a social phenomenon. It also explains and justifies why it's okay to sometimes break the rules, even though we often benefit from them. If people are not benefiting from them, then it would be okay to break them, or if they're biased, it would be okay to break them. A big problem with social contract theory is that the scope of the moral community that it recommends to us is one which is not nearly inclusive enough. All right, so I look forward to hearing what you have to say in our weekly discussion question, which will relate to social contract theory, and we'll talk about, which will raise a debate about a topical ethical issue. So thanks for sticking with this. It's a difficult theory, but I look forward to hearing what you have to say on the discussion board. All right, see you next time.